I want to talk about a subject a little different than I normally do today. We're going to talk about the car's cooling system, specifically on the 3 turbo. There will be some overlap between a CX30, CX50, and then some of the other 2.5 turbo cars. The cooling circuit diagram is fairly close, but there are some differences between the liquid to air car and then the regular air to air intercooler car. All right, so this is a diagram, kind of like a flow chart of how the coolant moves through the cooling system on the 3 turbo. It's the same as the CX30 and the CX50. The difference between that and the earlier cars that are the air to air intercooler is you're not going to have the secondary circuit. So I'm going to talk about the secondary circuit to start. So you've got radiator here. The bottom portion of it, there is a heat exchanger, and that is what cools the coolant coming out of the intercooler down. So leaves, goes through an electric water pump. That's all PWM duty cycle controlled, depending on a lot of factors that the car takes into place. I wish we had all the tables defined for that so we could keep the intercooler and circuit cooler as well as the charge air. So it goes down, goes in through the intercooler portion that's inside the intake manifold. Then it goes back up into the reserve tank. This is the reserve tank that is on top of your radiator with a low pressure cap on it, and then circles in there. So there is no intermix between the low temperature circuit, which is what this is called, and then the high temp circuit in the top of the radiator. This is the radiator, so you can see kind of where it's split at the bottom. That little guy is the heat exchanger for. So when you see it, I had a couple people ask me where it's at. That's where it's at, is that little guy at the bottom. Here's kind of a picture of the intake manifold where the intercooler sits. So if you're looking at the front of the car, got your intake manifold right here. These hoses going into the side are the intercooler core. This is kind of what it looks like if you were to just pull it out. It slides right into the manifold. Air comes into the side here, goes into this passage here, forces its way through the intercooler core here, up, down, into the cylinders. This is where it injects the EGR. So EGR gases come in from the top. This is where they hook on. The EGR cooler goes right here, puts your cooled EGR down here, comes out here. As the air is coming in here, it mixes then up into the cylinders there. So when you're looking at intake manifold temp number 2, that's this guy right here. So it's reading the charge air from here, like the cooled down, plus mixed in with your EGR temp at the same time. All right, so back to our picture here. Let's talk about the high temp cooling circuit. So you've got the cylinder block, cylinder head. So coolant goes from the block to the head, and then it leaves. So this is your thermostat housing assembly. Cylinder head temperature is the hottest temperature inside the engine. So coming out of there, it goes into a couple different spots. So you've got one spot that goes straight into the transmission cooler, which then goes into your EGR cooler. Then that goes into a main pipe that dumps it right back into the water pump. So when you're, that's part of the reason why I did lower temp thermostat, is because the transmission does run warm on these. And that's because you're not really getting cooled coolant to it. You're getting cylinder head temp, which is pretty warm. So it doesn't have a lot of opportunity to actually do an exchange with the transmission fluid with that cooler / exchanger warmer that's on the side of the transmission. So you've got that circuit there. It then goes to the throttle body off this other branch, which dumps back into the EGR cooler. Then you've got one that comes out, down, goes to your heater core, and then it goes to your oil cooler heat exchanger, which is on the back of the cylinder block on the 2.5 turbo cars. None of the NA cars have a setup like this. Some of the early ones with the CX5s had a heat exchanger on them, kind of like this. It was in a different spot, but it was only in certain markets. But all the 2.5 turbos have this on them. And that dumps back into that main spot that goes back to the water pump. Then you also have this one that goes down, then it splits. Part of it goes into the radiator. The other part of it goes to the turbo, which then goes back into that main spot, back down into the water pump. So here's a cutaway of the thermostat housing. So you can see it comes from the cylinder head. You can see your spots going off to the upper radiator hose, throttle body, and where that splits off to the turbo, the heater core, transmission cooler, and then from the lower radiator hose would be where the coolant from the radiator comes from. When that's closed off, it just circulates in that housing and sends to its respective spots. When the thermostat starts to open, then it starts to mix in the cool water there. So this is my car on the lift with the bumper off. This is kind of the next piece to the cooling equation that these cars have. Is you've got these active grill shutters here behind everything. So right now they're closed. Under here is where the liquid air heat exchanger is. And then your radiator gets most of its flow from here. There is some that is pushed up from here, but you have a pretty good section of the radiator that you don't get any flow through. A lot of times these are not fully open. So what I've done on mine, because I do live in a hot climate, is I've had these unplugged for a couple of years in the on or in the fully open position. If you want to do that, the easiest way to do it is turn your air conditioner on, and this little connector right here. So when the air conditioner is on, these will be fully, like if it's on max and you're not moving, these will kick all the way open. You can unplug that, you're good to go. It will set a network communication error on the dash. Unless you have tune, you can just turn that code off, which I do, so I don't have to worry about that. So there's a lot of factors that go into how these open and close. Basic function is you've got a couple steps they'll hit. There's either 90 degrees, which is fully open, or 6 degrees is kind of like start, and then there's some in between points on that. So if you're going less than 99.4 miles an hour, your coolant temp is less than 270 degrees, and you don't have a lot of load on your AC, then they're not open very much. If you're over 99.4 miles an hour, you have 212 degrees of coolant temp or more, or you have significant AC compressor or AC refrigerant pressure, or it needs to be for condenser cooling, then it'll open fully. There's some other things like if you're in boost, like if you're heavy on boost, they'll crack open. If you're just cruising, they'll shut down sometimes in the 40-degree range. I'll show that. Okay, so this is a graph showing about a 10-minute log last summer that I made. So we're in higher ambience, start out about 115, drops down to mid 90s. There's an elevation change in here, so that's why we get the temperature change. We go up about 2,000 feet. So green is vehicle speed mile per hour. Orange is the grill shutter duty cycle request. 100% is all the way open. 0 is all the way closed. And then vehicle speed is blue in mile per hour. So there's a whole bunch of stop and go. You can see that they close and they open back up when we're coming to, like, this is about 30 miles an hour, and then we slow down and so forth. We get up to cruising around 35 miles an hour, and then they shut down to about 10%, open a little bit, and then they open all the way back up when we're doing a whole bunch more stop and go. And then they open and close a couple times here, and then we're open because we're sitting here for a while at a light. Then they close again once we get going. Then we accelerate to get back at a higher speed. They crack open for just a little bit, and then they close off, and then they just sit there for about 46%. This is representing a couple minutes of time just cruising around those speeds. And then they open and close quite a bit more as we're doing some more stop and go. So what that does is that has the effect of trapping a lot of heat under hood on these cars. So if you've opened the hood on them, they are kind of prone to heat soak. And this is one of the reasons is you've got your grill shutters that are opening and closing all the time, which is one of the reasons why I kept mine open. Because when we're in that extreme heat, you do notice it. One of the reasons I wanted to make this video was to kind of segue into why I run the CX50 thermostat in my car. When the Skyactivs first came out, the 2.0 and the 2.5 had a thermostat that opened at 177 to 182 degrees and then was fully open by 203. In comparison, the turbo engine in the US and Canada only has a thermostat that opens at 188 to 193 and then isn't fully open to 212. Everywhere else in the world that the 2.5 turbo is sold, like Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Europe, it's a few other markets it's sold in, like in the CX9, they run a thermostat that runs in the same range as the original NA cars. So I originally was going to try that thermostat and drop it down a little bit and then rescale my fans. But when Mazda updated the 2.5 in 23 and removed the coolant control valve and gave it a traditional thermostat, they used the same temperature that the CX50 does, which it opens at 167 to 171 and is fully open by 190 degrees Fahrenheit. So that has a pretty big effect on the overall cooling system, transmission, how much cooler it keeps that. When my car lost its differential, I had a 24 naturally aspirated all-wheel drive car that I had for about a week while they were doing it. Logged it a bunch. Coolant temp stayed awesome, around 170 to 180, and the transmission wasn't that far behind. One of the things I really didn't care for on the factory thermostat on my car was the transmission temp. If you were Once it was fully warmed up and you were driving around town, you'd see 220 to 230 degrees on the trans temp quite often. Personally, because of what I do and what I see, I don't like that much temperature running through a transmission. So I was looking, and I'm still probably going to do something about an external transmission cooler to pull some more heat out of it. But this is what running the lower temp thermostat in my car has gained me, both in coolant temps, engine oil temps, and transmission fluid temps. So living where I do, you hop on the freeway. We have high ambient again. Live about an hour ish or so north of Vegas in the desert. But this is a graph I made before and after installing the lower temp thermostat on coolant temps, trans temps, and engine oil temps. And they were both in about 100-degree ambient at the same spot in the same road after the car was completely warmed up for about a half an hour before getting to this particular section of the road. So, top here, this dark green is transmission fluid temps. And you can see we're 220 plus, and then it spikes up here pretty good. Engine oil temp is blue. We're again around 220 ish. Follows the same. Then engine coolant temp. So they're all pretty close to there. And with the coolant temp being the way that it is, that regulates how the car's set up. That coolant temp regulates engine oil temp and transmission temp because it both goes through the exchangers that are regulated by the main cooling system. So the ones below it are my lower temp. You can see, I'm in the 180s on my trans. I'm in the 180s on my oil temp. And then we're in the 170s to 180s on my engine coolant temp. So immediately we got that. So I ran some averages on, again, this same section of road on what that looks like. So what that looks like averaged out is on the factory thermostat, my engine oil temp averaged 221 degrees. My coolant temp averaged out to 215 degrees, and my trans temp averaged out at 227 degrees. Running the lower temp thermostat, my engine oil temp was 185, 176 on the coolant, and 188 on the transmission. So that's a pretty good drop, 20 to 30 degrees almost all the time, which for the longevity of the car, plastic components under the hood, the transmission itself, it's pretty decent. I'm not worried about engine oil temps where they're at because of where the temp gauge is located on the back of the engine. It doesn't read sump temperature. So sump temperature is going to be different. That means the oil in the rest of the engine is going to be a little bit warmer from where this reads. The transmission temp, however, is taken from the sump. So any good jump down in temperature you have on an automatic transmission only helps longevity of the unit and helps holding power. The hotter the trans fluid temp gets on a lot of units, they actually lose the ability to handle as much torque as when it's cooler. So to finish this one up, I'm going to take us to one of the last things that you gain from running like a lower coolant temp in these cars. So Mazda's NOx control strategy is very aggressive to get the higher horsepower rating that they do versus like 87 versus 93, 91, etc. They throw a bunch of timing at the engine and then they back it off when it thinks it's going to knock, or when it actually knocks, it'll pull timing and it puts that, Mazda calls it knock control strategy. There's a KCS learning. You'll see that PID like in Mazda Edit and in some of the scan tools. And it's a file that it builds. You think of it as like a long-term fuel trim. It knows that it's knocked at this point before under certain conditions, or that it may knock, and so it has a predetermined amount of timing that it's going to pull from that. So these are the knock, or the KR, the knock retard events that I experienced in that same drive. It was about 30 minutes on the freeway. So on the stock thermostat, I had 621 corrections that it made. On the low temp thermostat, it made 301 corrections. So less than half the corrections it made And what you'll see next is that they were more positive corrections versus negative corrections, because the car will make positive and negative corrections. So a lot of these were negative. Some of these were negative because it's unavoidable when you're cruising at low RPM, high load on the freeway. You're in a more region that has a higher propensity to knock. And so you'll still have corrections. This is the averaged amount of all those knock events and where it kind of put us from that last graph. So it was about 30 minutes or so on the freeway. Car decided that it was going to build into the KCS learning strategy a negative 0.033. So that's not saying that it's pulling that much ignition from it. That's just an assigned weighted value that the car knows it has to pull a base timing amount to keep it out of that knock range to keep it happy. So anything below 0 means it's going to be a negative timing correction baked in. Anything above 0 means that it's going to be a positive timing correction. So on the lower temp on that same run, it decided that 0.011 was the weighted amount that we were going to get for the timing corrections there. So I don't have 93 octane where I'm at. I'm limited to 91. Usually on the stock thermostat around town driving in the summer, I will have like a negative zero point 0.1, zero point 0.2. I've had a negative zero point 0.4 when it's really hot outside. Last year, um, when I was driving around in the summer with the thermostat, I would average anywhere up from zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.2. So keeping the car at a lower temp has definitely allowed it to build some positive timing correction, even in the heat of the summer with only 91. I'm not saying everybody should go and do this. I'm not. That's not what this is here. This is kind of explain what the reasoning is behind running a lower temp thermostat and some of the things you can see while doing that.